I was very keen on table tennis, and before long, I had the whole school playing table tennis. The teachers against the students against each other. The whole school was playing table tennis, and the headmaster had to call me in and say, "Look, you've developed table tennis here, but this school is about scholarship, and I'm going to stop it." I think I have some quality that gets people involved and excited in things, and maybe that is one of the things that's carried on through my scientific career.
I was brought up in London, where my father had his observatory. He was an astronomer, and he was the first director of the University of London Observatory, which was and still is, in fact, in Mill Hill. And it was being built when I was quite small. There were 3 telescopes in the observatory, and the smaller one I actually used a lot. We sort of called it my telescope, and it was quite small. It was an 8-inch refractor, and I used to look at globular clusters and stuff like that. And I had my own spectroscope, and I had a little laboratory with instruments, and I always loved playing about with them. Marco, it was kind of play. It wasn't serious science. I used to sort of play with instruments and look through telescopes without really doing much in the way of making proper measurements, just sort of fooling about, which I must admit I still do to some extent.
How did I become a scientist? I feel it's always been in me in a sense, and I was speaking earlier about an experience as a child which sticks in my memory, which is being down Rye Lane with my mother as, I don't know, 5 or 6-year-old, one evening, and looking up into the sky and seeing the moon and the stars and thinking to myself, what's going on up there? I wonder what that's all about. Does it end? That kind of question came to mind.
Well, I always have had an interest in science, as I imagine many of us have, since I've been quite young. Essentially started with reading books about science and kind of progressed from there. Certainly, I was never a real star pupil in any way, shape, or form in high school, although I had maintained my interest in science there. One of the things that actually did get my interest in the science was when I was probably about 7, 8 years old, and one of my aunts gave me, for a birthday present, she gave me this token to get me into a book club. And so I started receiving books from the book club, and in fact, there was a series of books, and they were called All About Books. And the first book that I ever read was all about dinosaurs. And I didn't actually even have an interest in dinosaurs at the time, but I was fascinated that you could actually have this collection of knowledge in books. It just kind of opened up for me. Oh, in fact, yes. And then after that, there were a couple of more books. There was All About the Atom, which I thought was quite fascinating, and then All About the Solar System. So that's really probably where the real start of my interest in science started out, and it just kind of moved on from there and retained my interest in science, but I was not, exceptionally good at studying, shall we say, in high school. In fact, that would be pretty bad, really. I was a very average student, but I always retained my interest in science from that point on. And then from there, it just did develop.
My mother was a doctor, but a rather reluctant doctor. She'd been pushed into it by her mother. And so I wasn't exactly encouraged to consider that as a career, although she was interested in getting us thinking about biological things. I remember she had a microscope. She kept her microscope from her medical student days, and she had a whole box of slides which she'd made herself. In those days, medical students made their own histology slides, and we had a lot of fun looking at that, and she was quite interested in botany. So there was quite a lot of interest in those subjects, but not not in a way that it might be a way of earning a living, really. Well, I think when I was interested in science at school, it was put into my head by the physics master, who was a rather obsessional man, but a very, very good teacher and a very inspiring teacher. And he was particularly interested in the applications of science. And that's the thing that really grabbed me, the idea that science was not only a discipline, but actually something it could do some use. So that's what got me going at school in the sixth form. One of the applications of physics to life was in the school play. I remember that I wasn't any good at acting, but the physics master got me involved in the sound effects. He had a lot of quite sophisticated recording and playback equipment, and we set this up to provide sound effects for the play which he was producing. And I really enjoyed that activity where one was in the periphery of a theatrical production but not actually performing in it.
I come from a family which didn't really have any academic background. For various reasons, a very important influence on my life was my maternal grandfather, and I spent quite a bit of my growing up time in the East End of London. He had left school when he was 11 years old and had become a docker. And he was pretty convinced of the importance of knowledge, of learning. It was a good thing to learn. He was a great influence on myself and my brother and our cousins. I then moved off and went to a grammar school in Kingston-on-Thames, Tiffin Boys School, where there was an inspirational headmaster and inspirational teachers to go with him. And we were really told, you can do, you can achieve.
Well, I suppose I've always been interested in science, and particularly sort of animals and things like that, and natural sciences. And as a child, I used to be very interested in my pets. If they died, I used to bury them in the garden, and then I used to go into the garden a few months later and dig them up and then boil them and pull off all the flesh, and then I would string the vertebrae onto a coat hanger, and so that they would, in my bedroom, there would be these little skeletons of animals there. So I used to like finding out how things worked. And also my father used to do things with me, like he helped me make a little radio out of a cat's whisker and a little crystal, and I thought that was really fun. So I've always sort of been interested in it, and I think had quite a scientific family, so that sparked me off, although I did want to be a ballet dancer most of the time.
The careers officer said to me, now, you know, you're 15 years old, what do you want to do? And I said, well, actually, I wouldn't mind being a scientist. He said, he looked at me, you know, with incredulity. A scientist, he said, what makes you want to be a scientist? So I said, well, I'm quite interested in rockets and rocketry, because I had spent some time looking in the Science Museum at South Kensington, and I became, you know, in my own way, a bit of an expert on rockets and, you know, technological things of that sort. I used to spend hours there, you know, making drawings and all sorts of things. You know, I was really, really into it. I couldn't touch any of this, of course. It was just looking at it, but you know, I was very, very interested. And there was I think there still is an aeronautical museum there out South Kensington, so I spent hours there. And this chap was flabbergasted. He said, well, you want to be a scientist? He said, but you haven't got any qualifications. So I said, well, no, I haven't, but you know, even so, you know, you've asked me what I'd like to do, and that's what I'd like to do. One day, I mean, our family took the Daily Mirror as the
the paper that they looked at, and on Saturday, the Daily Mirror introduced an article called Children's Mirror, and I remember reading this one Saturday, and there was an article in there about this grammar school boy that had decided he wanted to be a rocketeer. He wanted to work in rockets, and he ended up working at this strange place in Aylesbury somewhere. And I was very interested in this because I thought, rockets, that's what I want to do.
And we're also in the era when school was as much about all the other things as it was about curriculum. So there were lots of other activities going on, and in my case, in my school, the Dramatic Society was a particularly strong element. I should say that a few years ahead of me was a guy called Michael Johnson, who you all know as Michael York, the actor. So that, you know, there was a very strong Dramatic Society, and I got involved in that, doing the technical things, doing the lighting, sound effects and all that sort of thing. As a child, I was always taking things apart. My father used to say that if I was given a birthday present or a Christmas present, then he knew it was a good one if I actually immediately got the screwdrivers out and took it apart. Usually I managed to get it back together again, but not always. So there was that predisposition towards science right from the word go, despite the fact that nobody in my immediate family was a scientist. So I'm not quite sure where that came from.
In the very early days of my sort of electronic stuff, okay, which really stems from a relationship with a chum of mine around the corner from Scouts, okay, and Jack and I used to tinker with electronics in those days, and one of the things that we did was a system of its earth resistance communication. So we used to shout at each other using earth resistance and audio amplifiers, and we triumphed over about 50 yards. We could actually manage to talk to each other, which was a huge achievement for us, and we were sort of, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, something like that, okay, and that went on for a bit, and then we got bored of that. Jack wanted to develop a railway system with remote control, and when I say remote control, this was all within his loft, and that involved taking old TVs apart and pulling apart the deflection coils and ending up with hundreds of yards of this wire, so that we could have the railway on one side of the room and a map of the railway on another side of the room. And Jack developed part razor blades which were operated by the train wheels, such that they made contact every time a train wheel went over and allowed some lights to be lit on this map, and that was part of our first playing around with electronics.
Yeah, I think my first interest in science and biology goes back to my school days, and the biology teacher, like many people who go into science, I used to look after the plants in the greenhouse. I looked after the animals. I found all that very interesting and exciting, and that was one of the subjects I excelled in. I enjoyed, that particular part of my schooling, and I thank the likes of Mr. Herald, for introducing me to biology. Then I sort of followed a career path where I developed into a technician on my career path at Liverpool University.
I had no intention of being a scientist. I just enjoyed life with a very open, simple, probably uncritical, unfocused mind. I lived in the country as a boy. It meant that I didn't really associate with all my friends who lived in town and did things that teenagers do, and I couldn't because we lived so far away. It meant that I spent my life with a great friend, mostly on the beach, fishing, swimming, always there. And I guess that helped nurture my enjoyment of beach life. I did biology projects on mussel beds, and one thing led to another, I guess, and wanted to continue enjoying that. Hence an application to Newcastle University to study zoology, chosen in part because they had a great marine biology station, and I thought that would be fun. I could imagine myself searching and understanding marine life. Went to Newcastle, felt liberated because I no longer had to do subjects at A level like physics, which I couldn't do very well. And there was a pleasure in learning. There was a liberation. Loved zoology, loved the discovery of the coelacanth at the time, the fossil now alive. It was a great time. But I had to do other courses. I had to do physical sciences, which I didn't really enjoy, and I had to pick another subject. Chose physiology, which at school I'd never heard of before. By the end of the year, I realised I'd loved zoology, but kind of didn't know where that would go. But a feeling inside me told me that physiology was a bit more hardcore science, a bit more directed, and might lead to different and better things. And I had no idea what that meant.